Welcome to today's webinar. We're just giving a few minutes to the rest of the participants to join. So we shall kick off in about 2 minutes. Participants are coming in pretty quickly. So in the interest of time, we shall begin. Thank you for joining us for this morning as we demystify the budget for 2023, which has been set at a whopping 3.3 trillion, up from Kenyan shillings 3 trillion last year. So we saw a lot of mixed reactions from members of the public on the budget allocation, as well as certain tax measures, which we shall be discussing this morning. So I'd like to encourage you to keep engaging us through the Q&A chat box, and our team of specialists will respond to you on a real-time basis. My name is Sandeep Main, and I'm an associate director within the Tax and Regulatory unit of KPMG East Africa, and I will moderate today's webinar. To start us off, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the budget 2023. So please take a few moments to respond to the poll question that you will see on your screen. So as you can see, we all heard the budget proposals. What is your reaction? Do you think they were positive? Do you think they were negative? Or how many of us are indifferent? They made no difference to what we are currently experiencing in this economy. Do you think those proposals were set to accelerate the economic recovery? I'm seeing a lot of people responding. We have a good rate already. We're at 70%. That's very good. Keep the responses coming in. And I'm sure you can see on your screens, a lot of us felt indifferent, but it seems it's really between negative and indifferent. A very small percentage of us actually think it's positive, so that's very interesting. So I'm going to close the poll in about 5 seconds, so please do share your views. 3, 2, 1. So as we can see, a number of us felt that they're indifferent to the proposals made by the CS. And I'd like to introduce Clive Okora, a partner with KPMG Tax. He's a tax partner, has been with the firm for just about 17 years, so 17 years experience in tax, who will be taking us through the macroeconomic environment in Kenya. So Clive. Sorry, before we get to Clive, Caxton, Peter Kinuthia, apologies for that, will be giving us the opening remarks. Peter Kinuthia is a partner and head of tax in KPMG East Africa, has been with the firm for 20 years, so 20 years plus tax experience. We'd like to hear from Caxton on his opening remarks. Cax, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Sandeep, and good morning to all our viewers this morning, wherever you're listening us. Let me take this moment to also welcome all of you to the 2022-2023 KPMG Budget Insights webinar. We are delighted to have all of you, and as Sandeep has taken you through the poll there, we just wanted to get the pulse of what it is that our listeners this morning also feel about the budget that we've just gone through. If there was anything that was to give us an indication that this is really an elections budget, it is actually the timing when we have had this statement read. Traditionally, we have always had it in June, and we have done it 2 months before, so that it gives us adequate time to prepare and for the country to be ready with all the resources required to run elections later in the year. So as I look at what context to set as my team gets ready to really give the insights around the budget this year, I quickly want to reflect the backdrop against which this year's budget has been set. Listening to Kenyans the last few years, and more importantly, the last few months, there have been a number of concerns which the government sought to respond to. And some of these concerns include the high cost of living that has been topmost on everyone's mind. We have the issue of high unemployment, especially among the youth, and that has bedeviled this country for years. We have also had issues around income inequality. It reminds us of the many years when we were told we are a country of 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars. For those that are a little older here, will know that those words were uttered by one J.M. Kariuki. So that problem of income inequality still persists, and it is one that the government continues to grapple with. And last but not least, by any measure, is our public debt burden. I know everybody in this country, regardless of their profession, regardless of their background, have a view or opinion around the country's debt status. And it's no wonder it's one of the topics we will be covering a little later, especially in our panel discussion. Is our debt sustainable? Have we borrowed more than we can repay? So those are some of the key concerns that Kenyans have expressed around this time when we were going through the budget. And the government, having considered all of that, we would want to believe, came up with this view that they want to look very, very responsive to those key concerns. And they appropriately themed this year's budget as accelerating economic recovery for improved livelihoods. All those key concerns touch on people's livelihoods, and it is what the responses from the government that will assure Kenyans that really their livelihoods are going to be improved. So what is it that we look forward to? We have been in what we are calling the post-COVID times. Some people, yes, they still say we are in the COVID times, but we want to be a little more positive and say the worst of COVID is behind us. And now we can talk of post-COVID. And those were actually the wordings that were used by the CS as well. We are looking at the post-COVID economic recovery measures. Are we still looking at the stimulus? One sure way of trying to see what the government is doing around that is the allocations. They have said that agriculture still remains the backbone of this economy. However, we saw a reduction in terms of the allocation there, and we have that as one of the questions that then we need to address. So how can we say that agriculture is really the backbone, yet the allocations have actually reduced from what we had in the previous year? So it is not a straightforward discussion, and for those of us who have been looking at the government's budget-making process, it is not lost to us, and indeed to everyone, that the process of making the budget is always a delicate balancing act. That's a little cliche, but it is what it is. We have scarce resources. We have to stretch what is available to cover a myriad of people's needs, and thereby we end up not fulfilling everyone's expectations. We will always hope, like what it is said, man's rational expectations should, as far as possible, be fulfilled rather than frustrated. So has this budget fulfilled those expectations, or has this budget frustrated them? Maybe the second question is, have those expectations been reasonable? So those are the pertinent matters that this morning my team will help us unravel, will help us give these insights to you listening there, and see whether on a balance, our budget this year is what we would call a balance. We have the Big Four agenda, as I conclude on these remarks. We have said that this was always a good blueprint for the government to follow. How much have we allocated in terms of our food, nutrition, and security? That's what we've said. The allocations may have gone down. What's happening on the universal healthcare space? Where are we? with our manufacturing sector and affordable housing. Some of these things were touted to get us out of poverty. So it is all this and other matters that this budget aims to address. And without taking any further time, I would want to let you listen to our expert views, starting from the macros and then to the nitty-gritties. As they always say, the devil always lies in the details. So there are a few changes that have been brought, but before we get to them, we will also be looking at what the macro environment looks like. And for me, I would want to urge you, stay with us. We will try to be as precise as we can for the next 1.5 hours or so, maybe 2 hours at most. If with your attentive ears attend to this session, what here shall miss, as Shakespeare would say, our toil shall toil to mend. So all the very best, and I hand it back to Sandeep, who will then tell us what happens for the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caxton, for setting the scene for today's webinar. Before we get into the next presentation, a short poll that will appear on your screens. Please take a few moments to then respond to that. And ideally, the question is really around the, what do you see? Has the government actually done the best in terms of the key pillars that they had identified during the second medium-term plan of Vision 2030? So there are a couple of them there on your screen. So the first one was really around improving business climate. Do you feel that the tax measures or the budget allocations have enabled the businesses improve? Or do you think they've done really well in terms of closing the infrastructure gaps? Or do you think they've done well in promoting the investment in key sectors such as manufacturing? And as Caxton alluded to it, agriculture is a significant contributor towards our GDP. Or have they done well in terms of investing in health, education, and social welfare? And we did see education, infrastructure getting the giant share of the budget allocation. Or finally, which is a bit of a controversial one, did they do well in terms of fostering the devolved system of government to enhance the service delivery? Okay, so I'm going to give about a second to anyone who's not responded. We are at about 80% response rate. So do keep it coming, but it's very clear from what I can see. Most of us think that it's closing the infrastructure gaps, which really are very visible with the expressway and all the other infrastructure projects that the government commissioned. Okay. So the results are really around the infrastructure gaps that the government has done very well in closing, and that is really commendable. So it'll be good to hear now from a macroeconomic environment perspective on what the government was thinking around these particular pillars. So I'd like to invite Clive Okora, a partner with KPMG in the tax and regulatory unit, who's been with KPMG for the last 17 years, to now take us through the macroeconomic environment presentation. Clive, over to you.
Thank you, Sandeep, for that welcome. And now the poll results are very insightful in terms of what they're demonstrating. From the results, we see that the government has done very well in terms of infrastructure development. But we see that from the respondents, there's been a significant gap in terms of promoting investment in manufacturing, agriculture, and tourism. We also see that the government has scored a low in terms of improving the business climate, and also investing in health, education, and social welfare. So the big items that we see where the government has done well is in closing the infrastructure gap, which is very interesting, given that that is what we are currently seeing, as opposed to then the other social aspects, especially in terms of issues around, number one, what Caxton talked about, the high cost of living, the issues around unemployment, income inequalities, and the debt burden, which are the issues that we are very visible, and they're the issues that when the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury asked the citizens what they are most concerned about, they mentioned those as the issues that they wanted the government to address. So we will go through the macroeconomic background to the budget, and this sets the scene in terms of what environment was the CS operating in when setting out their the budget estimates, the budget priorities, so that then when you look at the highlights, we see how far the CS has gone in terms of meeting the expectations. Now, the budget is set in a context, and the context is both global and local. And we just look at some of the issues that have happened in the recent past in terms of the global outlook, because what is happening globally also impacts on what is happening locally. Now, post-COVID-19, the economy, global economy rebounded significantly at a rate of 5.9%. And this because during the COVID period, there were shutdowns and the economies had mostly contracted. So there was a significant rebound because of the reopening, leading to that particular growth. But subsequently in 2022, there have been a number of challenges which have caused the growth to go down to 4.4%. And we'll see just what some of those issues are. Now, the first thing that we need to consider is the issue of supply chains. And if you're keen, you'll have had issues around the shortage of containers, that the cost of shipping goods is now extremely expensive because you cannot get containers for your goods to be shipped from the production areas. There's the issue that you've heard about the shortage of semiconductors, which has resulted in reduction in production of goods or products such as motor vehicles. Then there have been issues around new COVID variants. Recently, you've heard that China has shut down Shanghai. And Shanghai is a city of 26 million people and is one of the main supply centers for the global economy. So even though in areas like Kenya, we've reopened up the economy, there are areas where there are still shutdowns, and those have an impact on the economy across board. Then from a macroeconomic stability perspective, there are a number of instances where we still have challenges, especially in terms of one, inflation. The other thing is debt sustainability, especially because during the COVID period, many governments put in measures to support vulnerable people, to support businesses. And because of that, their debt levels rose significantly. And that's an issue which is not limited to the countries outside of Kenya. So Kenya is one where we've seen this, but very many other countries across the globe are affected by this issue of debt sustainability. The other issue is around commodity prices, especially when you think about the issue of the price of foodstuffs, imported foodstuffs, the price of commodities. Right now, if you think about the price of construction inputs, the price of steel, the price of cement has been going up. The price of petroleum also has been going up. And that has got an impact in terms of how it affects the cost of living. The other issue is on climatic change. This is a very topical issue in terms of how our various activities are affecting the economy, how they're affecting food security, how they're affecting energy supplies. And while this is a global issue, it's also a local issue. The last thing that we'll look at from a global outlook perspective is the issue of geopolitics, especially now the topical issue around the war in Eastern Europe and the impact it's got on the global economy. The first thing is, when you think about it, the two countries, Ukraine and Russia, supply about 25% of the wheat that is consumed in the world. Russia is a major supplier of petroleum, and the impact of disruptions in those supplies is being felt across the globe. Now, if we look at the local scene in terms of what is happening in Kenya, We've had a significant rebound, especially in 2021 with the reopening of the economy, with the economy growing at about 7.1% in 2021, but expected to slow down to 6% in 2022. A number of issues are responsible for this. Number one, high inflation, which we've seen at a rate of around 6% against a target of 5%. Food prices have been going up. Petroleum prices have been going up, and those have got an impact on food inflation and transport-related inflation. Then there's the pressure on the shilling against the dollar. And then when you think about it, the government has done very well in terms of revenue collections, but what you ask yourself is, if the economy continues the way it's going, are we able to sustain those collections if the economy is not doing very well? The last thing is on debt. And the latest we know is that about 60% of tax revenues are now going to service interest and principal repayments, which means out of what we collect, only 40% is available for our expenditure, both recurrent and development expenditure. What does that mean? It means then we've got to get more debt to pay our recurrent expenditure, which means we are effectively continuing to dig ourselves into a hole at the moment. The other thing just to look at, important things. Number one, from this particular graph, we talked about inflation, but you see from an inflation perspective, the biggest drivers of inflation have been the food prices, the fuel costs, which have been driving the inflation rate up. When you look at the table across on the right, two things are important. You can see that the GDP has been growing. And one thing that we ask ourselves then is that if the GDP has been growing, how comes the number of people complaining that the economy is not working for them has been growing? So are the policies that the government is implementing impacting the majority of the Kenyans? And that's an important thing to ask, especially when you look at the budget priorities, where the government is intending to spend its money, and whether those particular areas have got the impact that they're expected to have. Now, if you go to the very topical issue around the debt question, it's an important question. And it's an important question from a number of aspects. Number one, there's the split between domestic and external. There's the issue around the debt ceiling and what is going to happen on the debt ceiling, because remember, we've got a debt ceiling of 9 trillion. As at April, our debt was around 8.4 trillion, which means if we consider the additional deficit that we're going to have for this particular year, we're likely to breach that particular debt ceiling. But another important thing just to consider, especially from an external perspective, as the Kenya shilling depreciates, it also means that our debt portfolio increases automatically because of the depreciation, because the external debt, we get it in terms of foreign currency, but we've got to generate funds in terms of local currency to then convert into dollars to pay off. So even without borrowing, as long as the shilling depreciates, then we are likely to breach the debt ceiling that we currently have. There's the question that the government has indicated that they want to change the basis for determination of the debt ceiling from a fixed figure of 9 trillion to 55% of GDP. Well, the first question is the current GDP as per the CS budget was around 14 trillion. So if you calculate 55% of that, it comes to around 7 trillion. So there's sort of something to understand around those particular calculations in terms of if it was to be implemented today, does it mean that automatically then we are in breach? Although then there's the issue that the cabinet secretary can always go back to parliament to request for that to be extended if there are extenuating circumstances, possibly like the war, COVID-19, and issues like that. The last thing that we also just need to consider is the issue of debt maturity. In the budget, the CS talked about extending the term of the debt portfolio from around 7 years to 9 years, which is a continuing process. And you can see that in terms of how the debt has been spread. But one important thing is the issue of the debt that is maturing over the next 1 year, which is about 25% of the total debt portfolio. This is mostly probably around the treasury bills that are due to, which have got a shorter maturity period. And there's still much to be done by the government in terms of then moving from the short term to the long term sort of maturing debt to effectively spread out the repayments. The last thing that we look at from a macroeconomic perspective is the specific concerns and risks that face the budget in terms of implementation. What are those issues that will make or break the budget if they do occur or if they are not managed well? And this we look at from the perspective of the local and external risks impacting on the budget. The first one, and interestingly enough, this being an election year, it didn't feature very much in the budget. The issues around the uncertainties around the elections, and also the need to accommodate the manifestos of the various governments that will come into place. So being an election year, it's very certain that this is unlikely to be the full budget that we'll have for the entire year, because if you've been listening, you've heard the various competing parties indicating what their priorities are going to be when they assume power. So there are issues around social safety nets, there are issues around specific investments, and a number of these are not captured in the current budget. And what is going to happen then when a new government comes into place? They may need to do a supplementary budget to allow them to implement their specific manifestos. So we do then expect that possibly in August, September, November, thereabouts, there will be a significant supplementary budget that will sort of realign expenditure priorities to what the next government will be targeting. The other thing is how do we balance immediate and future needs? So for instance, Caxton did mention that some of the priorities that citizens mentioned were the high cost of living, issues of unemployment, issues of inequality. And the issue is, have this been fully targeted in the current budget? One interesting thing is the whole issue around the Big Four and the fact that the allocations, especially for agriculture, the allocations for manufacturing have been reduced. And those are the key sort of areas that have been targeted to, number one, lead to the reduction of cost of living through increased food production, generate employment opportunities, especially in the manufacturing sector. And then the issue then is, if we then are reducing the allocation, what then are we thinking about in terms of these specific priorities, which are of immediate need to the citizens? The other thing is around COVID-19 and the risk that there could be new variants arising, and we don't know exactly how those will impact the supply chains or even the local economy as to whether we will then go into lockdowns or not. The last thing, which is external, this is something that we sort of need to always keep at the back of our minds, especially the conflict in Eastern Europe and the various iterations it's currently taking. So for instance, there have been questions around completely banning the export of Russian gas into Europe. And if that is to happen, then it's likely that Europe will go into a recession. And if it goes into a recession, then that could trigger a global recession. What's the impact? That could have an impact, number one, on our exports. It could be less demand for the exports that we export into Europe. Number two, it could impact the levels of tourism, especially the people who will want to travel to Kenya, which would impact our tourism industry. And the various issues that we mentioned around the prices of basic commodities. So these are important things that we need to consider. And even as you see that the various trends on the right in that particular graph, they are all trending up in terms of the price of crude oil, the forex rates. All those show that the macroeconomic environment that we are currently facing remains extremely volatile and has to be managed very well if the budget is to succeed. I'll stop there and request Sandeep to run the next poll as we go to the next session, where we will be looking at the specific interventions that the minister has come up with and whether those address the specific concerns that we have within the macroeconomic environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clive, for that excellent presentation on the macroeconomic environment of our country. What I heard you say, some key things that came to light was really around the inflation, the high rate of inflation, as well as the excessive debt, if I may call it that. I do know the 9 trillion going all the way up to 12 trillion in terms of debt is quite excessive. And then obviously you did a very good job in telling us about the Forex instability. Although, as we all recall, when the budget speech was read yesterday, the CS actually mentioned that the Forex was quite stable. That might not really be the case on the ground. We all know that the Forex currently, I think for the USD is at 115 plus. So that in itself has had a major impact on businesses, on taxpayers, on individuals. The common wananchi as well are feeling the pinch of the high taxes. And in this regard, I'd like to launch the next poll question, and it would be good to get your insights onto that. So effectively, do you think that this budget actually addressed our concerns as Kenyans? Do you think the cost of living is going to reduce with the proposed measures? And bear in mind, we heard about the insurance for boda boda passengers. Will they really afford it? And then we talked about the high level of unemployment. So the CS did mention some incentives previously to different sectors, and currently specifically to the pharmaceutical sector through the healthcare. Will that really create the level of jobs that we're looking at? It did mention some budget allocations for the youths, and if we heard what he said, he talked about them cleaning gutters or cleaning the streets. Is that really what we want? Do you really think that these policies or these particular proposals will impact us positively? So the answers to that should be yes. And wow, there are some participants who are saying yes, okay. And we do have a majority of the participants saying no, they did not make any impact. And it would be good to hear your thoughts on chat as well. Why do you think no? Why do you think yes? And we do have some participants saying they're probably not sure. Maybe some did benefit and some do not. Is this really, were these particular proposals really in line with the budget theme? And hear this clearly: accelerating economic recovery for improved livelihoods. So is that budget proposal really speaking to that theme? So I'm going to give us about another 1 minute to actually respond to this very critical question. And as I mentioned, please let us have your thoughts on why do you think, because the majority here are saying no, why do you think that we are not, these budget proposals are not in line with reduced cost of living and obviously increasing the employment rate? All right, still the majority here are no and are leading, so I will end the poll here. As you can see, 82% of us are of the opinion that the budget proposals did not meet what we had expected. So they're below expectation in terms of the rising cost of living and the high unemployment rate. And in this regard, we'll move to the next presentation, which is really around the fiscal highlights. So Steve Nganga is a director, associate director with KPMG in the tax and regulatory space. He's been with the firm for 15 years, and he'll be taking us through the fiscal highlights and telling us how this particular budget is going to be allocated and what would be the revenue mobilization. We do need from revenue collections about 2.1 trillion. How is this going to be possible? So Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Sandeep. Interesting. When I've looked at that poll and the answer that has come through there, one of the things that comes clear is that whatever you were expecting and whatever came through Parliament yesterday, through the CS for Treasury, are two different things, and therefore it begs a question as to whether there's a disconnect between the government and us as the people expectation. So let's go through and see how the CS then intends to spend the money that he spoke about yesterday, and that's through what you call the fiscal highlights. So the headline, the number that all of us need to remember, is that we have a budget of 3.3 3.42 trillion. 3.3 trillion. So that's one thing that we need to remember in terms of the numbers that the CES presented yesterday. And he went on to speak about how we intend to use that amount. And the first thing that you need to think about is this amount is going to be spent in what you were saying to make our lives better as Kenyans in the next 12 months. But when you go into the breakdown, what do we see? So the first thing we see is that the ministerial current expenditure. And this for us within what we call the current expenditures. So we see 1.4 trillion going into that. 1.4 trillion, speaking a part of which then goes into salaries and wages. And I know we've spoken about the cost of salaries and wages in Kenya. And when you break that number down, it is at about 516 billion of this 1.4 billion. 1.4 trillion goes into payment of salaries and wages. And then you go further and ask yourself, okay, so if this amount is going to be spent for salaries and wages, then what is left to be spent? So you drill down and see that interest and pension will take about 841 billion. Now, Clay spoke about the debt. And spoke about the amount of this budget that is going into payment of debt. Now, the interest element is about 840 billion, but there's a principal aspect of those loans, which is about 240 million. So the combined amount of both principal and interest repayment is about 1 trillion. So we step back and ask ourselves, so we've got a budget of 3.3 trillion, but 30% of that is going to repayment of loan, both the principal and interest. So then you are left with about 60%, that then you need to distribute between development expenditure and other recurrent expenditures. So we go to the next step. So we've got approximately 2.2 trillion that then goes into development expenditure, and how much is allocated to that? The CS allocated about 674 billion to development expenditure. We post there. So effectively means the amount that is available for development in the next 12 months is approximately 674 billion before we think about the allocation to county governments. And I know someone would argue that part of the money that goes to county allocation is all used to in development. And therefore, then we ask ourselves, so how much then was allocated to county governments? And that's about 407 billion. Now, we need to remember that on this 407 billion, 370 billion is what is provided for from the equitable share. Now, we always hear conversation with the Auditor General in terms of how the funds are being spent in this country. We have seen delays in signing of the financial statements. And sometimes we don't realize what is the impact of that conversation at the Auditor General perspective. Remember, any equitable share allocation on of the county funds is pegged on a percentage of the audited financial statements. At this point, when you look at what has been allocated, the 370 billion of this 407 billion is translated to about 27% of the last signed financial statement of the government, which was in for the year 2018, 2017, 2018. And therefore, we are having a budget of 2022, but we are using a base of 2017, 2018. And therefore, there's some hard question that then we need to ask ourselves, that the funds that are being allocated to the county, is it sufficient? We all celebrate devolution. If you go to most parts of this country, we see every single day people celebrating new roads in their areas, hospitals and all that. But I want us to remind ourselves that all this is happening from the allocation to the counties, the 47 counties of 370 billion. How much more can be done if we had the right amount of allocation? So that is how the government intends to spend the 3.3 trillion. Now, how are we going to finance that 3.3 trillion? The CS yesterday spoke about the tax revenue, spoke about the base, spoke about expanding, and we hear about the tax measures that are going to increase the tax revenue. And he said, out of this 3.3 trillion, he is optimistic that we can be able to collect tax revenues of about 2.1 trillion. 2.1 trillion under the current economic conditions. 2.1 trillion, when you know everything that has happened in this country, from inflation, from the cost of living, from the cost of running business, but he's still optimistic. He said, at the end of the day, we are hopeful as a government that we can be able to collect 2.1 trillion. The Kenya Revenue Authority, now Kenya Revenue Services, has been performing very well in the last 3 quarters. But there's something we need to ask ourselves realistically. Do we see the tax revenues increasing by 21% if you do a comparative with prior year? And then from there, then we've got the appropriation in aid, that's about 305 billion, and grants of 33 billion. Now, that's only the money that we can be able to generate internally, which therefore leaves us with a deficit of about 862 billion that need to be financed from other sources. And what the CS was speaking about, and what has been documented from a fiscal policy perspective, is that we will go out and borrow. So we have what we call the project and program loans. And this is where the IMF comes in. This is where the World Bank comes in. This is where we also speak about African Development Bank. But I want to do your interest to the IMF, because this is one of the things that have been spoken a lot. What is the impact of the IMF? How much are they lending to Kenya? What is the influence in terms of the policies? Under the current year, the amount that we are projecting to borrow from IMF is a rapid credit line of about 63 billion. And therefore, whatever we see out there, whatever we hear out there is something that we need to interrogate and ask ourselves, what exactly is happening? If you look at these numbers, we're thinking of financing. I mean, the deficit is going to be financed by those loans. We are going to borrow from external sources about 105 billion. We are projecting to borrow from the domestic market, the 581 billion. Think about Akiba, think about the treasury bills, think about the treasury boards. What is the impact of the government borrowing heavily from the local market? What does it mean? It means that there'll be a crowding out effect. It means then that the commercial loans that me and you go to the banks and borrow, the interest rates are going to be high. And then it's very important then to think about some of the actions that the government intends to take in terms of financing the deficit. And the last thing, and I spoke about this, is the foreign repayment. This is purely the repayment of the principal amount of the loans. Now, I want us to look at something slightly here. So when you compare the current year, the 2022-2023, with the previous year, which is the 2021-2022, which ends on 30th of June, you see a significant change on some of the items. So from a ministerial current expenditure, there's a change of 9%. Interest changes by about 21%. There's an increase. The contingency fund seems, although it's a small number, there's a decrease of about 20%, but overall the expenditure is growing by 10%. And then there's an indication that revenues are going to grow by about 18%, which is purely driven by the increase in the tax revenues. And therefore, when you look at item by item, it seems that we are growing as a country. And there could be an illusion that the revenues that we are collecting are going to finance that. I also want to draw your attention to something else. If you look at the interest and pension, at the 841 billion, the pension is about, give or take, about 25 billion. So largely that amount is on interest payment. So 841 vis-a-vis a deficit of 862 billion. Now you're beginning to see what exactly is happening in this country. So you've got the debt repayments, the principal and interest repayment is taking a significant amount. The recurrent expenditures again, are taken at all. And therefore, whatever is left for development is quite limited. And clearly, it's being fully financed. Because when you look at that number of 674 billion and the deficit of 62 billion, it therefore means that even whatever we're using to develop is money that is borrowed from the economy. Now, on that poll question, so the CES spoke about how he's going to allocate the resources. He spoke about 15 key areas. And part of those things, when you think about it, is there are areas that traditionally have taken a large share of allocation. And traditionally, education has taken a significant amount. And when you speak about education, the biggest beneficiary of this amount, of the 513 billion, is the TSC, the Teacher Service Commission that employs our teachers. It's going to take about 294 billion out of that. Again, the allocation on education, the second biggest beneficiary was the free-day secondary education, taking about 64 billion. And also the university took about 91 billion. That tells you the government priorities in terms of education. So the biggest one goes to the teachers, the TSC, and then that's followed by the secondary education. And that's in line with what the government of the day has been saying. We want to encourage education. It's been one of the pillars towards a sustainable economy. Then the second biggest beneficiary of this budget is the national security. And under this, we have two areas. We have the defense. The defense takes about 128 billion out of 317.8 billion. And for sure, we need to protect our borders, for sure. We need to think about things that are happening. We have seen our defense forces taking a lead in a number of areas of development, from firearms to the coast. We've seen what is happening there, and therefore, in terms of security perspective, that's taking the significant allocation, and that's followed by the National Police Service, which is being allocated 93 billion. Now, all these areas, when you go into details and see the priorities areas of where the government is allocating funds, then you begin asking yourself, what is the intention of the day? Because most of these areas are more of medium to long term as opposed to short term. And let me turn to agriculture. So we've always said that agriculture is the backbone of the Kenyan economy. And that has been consistent over the years. Now, let's look at the amount that has been allocated to agriculture. That's about 39.1 billion. In that 39.1 billion, you would have expected to see a lot of money going to immediate and sustainable items. But what we saw yesterday is that the biggest allocation under agriculture is going to issues to do with climate sustainability. You would argue that yes, drought is a significant issue in this country, and therefore we need to think about the climate. Whereas that is very important, there are other immediate concerns of the country that possibly would have looked at. And therefore, when you see the significant amount is going into climate projects, when you see significant amount is going to inclusion projects, then you begin to ask yourself what exactly is happening. We would have expected to see quite a significant amount going to inputs. We would have expected to see significant amount going to help farmers in terms of the areas of coffee, tea, revivals, and all that. But when you go into the details in terms of how the amount was allocated, you see minimal amounts allocated to these critical aspects of the agricultural economy. Looks like we still have locusts with us, and because the CES allocated about 1.7 billion to locust eradication. So it's an area that is going to be of interest to watch, and on how we will continue with that aspect, and given what we've had in the past. ICT again continues to be a focus for the government, and the biggest allocation went to Konza City, and we are hopeful that one day some of these costs are going to bear fruits, and we'll see the results of the Konza City becoming our ICT hub, and all of us then can see that the significant amount has been allocated over the years, what it means. The other area possibly we can talk about is on governance and justice. The judiciary was allocated about 18 billion, but this is a year that we have elections, the general elections, and the CS allocated about 21 billion going to the general elections, which again is in line with what is expected to happen later in the year, come August. So most of the allocations in the various areas, be it health, I think the significant amount went to Kenya National Hospital and the Moi Teaching and Referral Hospital. Manufacturing, significant amount went to SEZ, about 2.6 billion. Then we also had an element of access to finance credit by SME of about 3 billion. So effectively what you are seeing is that the government of the day want to complete the projects. There's nothing significant in terms of new projects other than roads, where we had about 103 billion that is allocated to construction of new roads. And finally, on the transport, looks like we had to complete the Nairobi-Naivasha SGR because the CES allocated about 18 billion for the phase 2 of that, and about 9 billion for the Nairobi to Mombasa SGR. So the SGR still remains a priority in this government. Some of these things are purely to complete what is being done. And you will understand at the end of the day, it's a question of completing what has been started. But the question is, what is the impact of some of these things to the economy, to the real issues that are happening today? Now, we took time just to look back and ask ourselves, what has been happening in the last 4 years? And what you see is that there has been a lot of consistency in terms of government allocation in the last 4 years. Education has continued to be a big priority, and the government has focused on that. Big four agenda, we see allocation on food security, we see allocation on infrastructure, we see allocation on health. Now, given this was the last year, and given that everything that has been happening in the last 12 months, actually in the last 24 months, because of COVID impact, because of impact on the global economy that Clay spoke about earlier, because of the impact on the local economy, because of everything that is happening today in terms of the economy, we would have expected a shift or a slight shift on the allocation in the current budget, at least to be able to help business come back, to be able to somehow stabilize the economy. But what we saw is that it's a consistent application. Everything that has been happening in the last 4 years was repeated. And it will be good to see what happened next. If some of these funding, some of these priorities from a government perspective are going to be a fruit, not necessarily now, but in the next couple of years. And therefore, you go back to the question, the poll question. Did the government address the 5 main issues that we spoke about, the high levels of unemployment? And one of the things you ask yourself, what is driving the high levels of unemployment? The government would argue that they have allocated money to manufacturing, they have allocated money to construction of roads. There's money that was allocated under the economic stimulus of Kazi Mtaani. But then you start asking yourself, what's the nature of those jobs? What is the real impact? We didn't see allocation of funds to high value jobs. We didn't see an immediate allocation of funds that is going to help alleviate the first issue. And therefore, from a high level of unemployment perspective, I think the government came short of that, and more could have been done, and especially given where we are today. But the most important thing to think about is that most of these things that are being done has an impact of medium to long term. So in the next couple of years, when all these roads are completed, when all these houses are completed in terms of affordable housing, then there will be an element of alleviation. In terms of rising public debt, the only thing that we saw yesterday is a shift from external borrowing to domestic borrowing. And therefore, then you start asking yourself, even though there's a foreign exchange risk, but what is the impact of borrowing from a domestic market perspective? And then we are talking about increasing the debt ceiling. Is the government of the day really concerned with dealing with the issue of rising public debt? And remember, some of these loans the only issue that could have driven a change in the repayment amount is extending of the repayment period. So the government is still going back to borrowing so that they can finance the deficit. I don't want to be pessimistic, but I'm just keen to see whether we'll be able to correct the tax revenue that the government is hoping that increase on a tax revenue, given the economic conditions of the day, whether we'll be able to collect enough revenue. But I do suspect if that's not done, we are going to borrow to be able then to finance the deficit. And therefore, the second issue, again, there wasn't a clear way of dealing with it. Income inequality, again, from the allocations of the budget, there was nothing that was very clear. And I know Caxton spoke about this earlier. We didn't see that coming out clearly how the government intends to deal with that. High cost of living. Just a few days ago, we had a whole issue of fuel crisis. One of these would have expected the government to come in and say, look, this is one of the heavy taxed area, and therefore we intend to maybe reduce taxes or provide some elevation in terms of what is happening. And when you step back, fuel is just one component for us who possibly use the vehicles. But you need to ask yourself, what is a significant impact of fuel in terms of production, in terms of the manufacturing industry, in terms of the industries? And most of the comments we are hearing today is that the industries are passing on that cost of fuel, that cost of energy that is being passed on. Interesting, when we were looking at the allocation on energy, a significant amount has gone to the national grid. And one of the things that we then can hope is that the perennial energy issues is going to reduce. There was also an allocation of nuclear energy production, and looks like we want to play on the next league. But does that have an impact on the high cost of living? We would have expected to see significant areas where the government is saying, let's reduce taxes, let's address the issue of food prices through the tax measures. And I know we're going to speak about that in a short while, so that then that can be able then to alleviate and manage the runaway cost of living. And finally is on agriculture. Like I mentioned earlier, the significant amount is going to climate-related projects. Again, we would have hoped to see more investment in immediate areas that can be able then to help and sustain the agriculture. So there's still a debate. The debate is still out there, but from the fiscal measures, I think there's more that need to be done to address the concerns that we have for the day. Please allow me to stop there, and I may hand over back to Sandeep.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that insightful presentation. So clearly, key themes are coming out in this budget, which is really the high cost of debt, as well as some of the key allocations that were made in terms of the energy infrastructure and healthcare, national security, but a focus was not given to another key sector, which is agriculture. So with that, allow me to do one more poll question. So we have seen how the revenue mobilization is meant to be through the fiscal highlights. So we are looking at a possible 2.1 trillion, but in terms of total tax revenues, we are looking at 2.4 trillion. And the government had talked about a 50B that would be generated from additional taxes. So in your opinion, what would be the most efficient way for the government to actually generate the 50B? Remember, we closed at about 1.8 trillion last financial year, looking at Kenya revenue, no, not authority anymore, it's actually service in the proposal, to then get to 2.1 trillion, that's about a whooping 30B, and then going an additional 22, the 2.4. So what do you think the government should have actually done, or what do you think they are going to do to actually generate these additional taxes to finance the budget? And we all know that some of the measures that were there or not so tax intensive. So there was a serious focus on sin tax. So what else can they do? Should they keep increasing the tax rates? Should they reduce the tax incentives, which we have seen in the past? And it was a surprise that the pharmaceutical industry got some exemptions. Or should they expand the tax base? And expanding the tax base means let's get more people to actually pay tax, to contribute to the tax kitty. Or should they continue improving enforcement? And most of us know Revenue Authority do use data analytics quite a bit, just to leverage and see who's paying tax and are you paying the right tax? Or I think the most uncommon one there is levying new taxes. Should we introduce new taxes to meet the 50p? I'm going to give participants possibly another few minutes just to answer this poll. We are at 60%. Do take an opportunity to put down your thoughts under the Q&A or the chat button that's available, just so that we can keep the interaction going. And we do appreciate you keeping us engaged during this webinar. We are running slightly behind schedule, but we do assure you that this is very critical information that we are parting with today. And with that, I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. So as we can see, there is a bit of a competition between expanding the tax base and improving enforcement, and it's almost at a 50-50. So we do see the participants are saying we should expand the tax base, and I'm pretty sure these are the guys who are already heavily taxed. And then we do have others who are saying improve the enforcement. What measures of enforcement would you like the Revenue Authority to actually use to then collect this additional or generate the 50p? It would be good to hear. Please do share your thoughts. And I do see someone has commented and said perhaps a mixture of the two would be a good way to then generate the 50p, which too could be a hybrid solution. Now, we're now getting to the cream of this particular presentation, and I would like to introduce the three speakers together. The first one is James Kimani. James Kimani is a senior manager within the tax and regulatory unit, and he has been with the firm for 9 years. James Kimani will cover the changes to income tax, and then closely following him would be Kenneth Wanjohi. Kenneth Wanjohi is also a senior manager within the tax and regulatory unit at KPMG East Africa. And Kenneth will be taking us through indirect taxes, which is essentially the changes to VAT and excess duty. And finally, a very important one, which is really other acts. Alex Tani, who's our regulatory lead for KPMG East Africa, will be taking us through changes in other acts. And Alex has been with the firm for 9 years as well. So without any further delay, allow me to hand over to James Kimani for the first segment of the changes in the finance budget. James, over to you.
Thank you, Sandeep. So we look at the changes that the Cabinet Secretary proposed in this year's budget. And the first one that I want us to cover is the cash donations. You notice that the cash donations, when an institution gives a cash donations, it is allowed to deduct that or to claim that deduction onto when the entity where they have donated meets two requirements. One, the entity have to be tax exempt, and second, the entity need to be registered under NGO or what we call the SATES Act. So what has happened is that most of these entities are registered under other act, and therefore those donations are always disallowed from a tax perspective. So what the Cabinet Secretary is proposing is to remove that second requirement of registration by the SATES Act and the NGO Act to allow that donation which have been given to a charitable organization, which is then exempt, would then be, the companies will be allowed to claim tax, to claim deduction on that. The second element that the Cabinet Secretary proposed is the gain derived from the financial derivatives. Derivatives are financial contracts, between two or more parties, which are aimed to get a value at a certain point, such as options, swaps, and futures, or even forwards. So those gains in Kenya are taxable, but when those gains are then accrued by a non-resident, they are not then subject to tax. So the Cabinet Secretary then is proposing to subject those gains on those derivatives to tax. This is mainly to increase the tax base, just as you have suggested on that poll question. One of the ways the government then need to increase their revenue is to increase that tax base. The second really reason why the Cabinet Secretary would propose such an issue is to ensure there is equity and fairness. As I have said, such gains, which then are accrued to an entity which is a tax resident in Kenya, are then subject to tax. But the ones that are then accrued by a non-resident are not subject to tax. So basically, the Cabinet Secretary is trying to bring fairness and equity in terms of taxation. The third proposal that the Cabinet Secretary brought in, you'd recall the Finance Act 2021 overhauled the thin capitalization, which then was 3:2 debt to equity ratio and 2:1 for extractive industries. And that now was brought to limiting it to 30% of the earning before interest, tax, and depreciation. These exempted the banks and financial institutions. It also exempted micro and small medium enterprises. However, microfinance institutions were left out. You notice that the same way banks operate, about 40% of the expenses for microfinance institutions are really interest. And if these were then microfinance were subjected to this interest restriction, definitely the issue of the deferment that we have made in the last few years in terms of the financial sector would then be hampered. Therefore, the Cabinet Secretary is proposing to also exempt micro and financial institutions, microfinance institutions from the thin capitalization issue. The other change that we witnessed is the additional reporting requirement for multinational enterprises. You'll recall the Finance Act 2021 introduced country by country reporting for multinational entities which are headquartered in Kenya. And what now the Cabinet Secretary is proposing essentially is to introduce the same reporting for all the entities which are not necessarily headquartered in Kenya. The purpose for this really is to bring greater tax transparency and also be able to ensure that whatever the information that is then reported, the the Commissioner General is able to get this information in good time. So those are the few changes that we had from an income tax perspective. Unlike last year, where we experienced a lot of changes from an income tax perspective, this time loud, we didn't have so many changes around this area. The next area that we're going to cover is on indirect tax, and allow me to introduce my colleague, Kenneth Wajohi, to take us through that.
Thank you, James. So from an indirect tax perspective, and we'll begin with VAT. That is the changes to the VAT Act. So in this year, we have seen fewer but targeted proposals, and most of these are being targeted to the healthcare industry and also the manufacturing industry. So example, for the healthcare industry, we have seen that the CS is proposing some changes when it comes to manufacturers of pharmaceutical products, and this is exempting any plant and machinery that is being used to manufacture the pharmaceutical products. Similarly, for the medical oxygen that is supplied to registered hospitals, you'll see that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, medical oxygen is primarily used, in terms of the treatment of that COVID pandemic. So what you're seeing is that in this, by exempting the medical oxygen, which is supplied to the registered hospitals, then it is a good boost in terms of the fight towards COVID-19. Also, what we have seen is in the healthcare, urine bags, adult diapers, artificial breasts, colostomy or ileostomy bags, and mostly these are used in cancer treatment.
we have seen that in order to reduce the cost of such medical supplies, then the CES is also proposing an exemption on these certain medical equipment. Now, in terms of boosting the manufacturing industry, and this is in line with the Big Four agenda of manufacturing and job creation, what we have seen is that in the automotive industry, the inputs are raw materials which are going to be used in the manufacture of passenger vehicles. They will be exempted from VAT. Similarly, if you now make a sale of the local manufactured passenger motor vehicles, then that sale would be equally exempted from VAT. So that is what we had from a VAT perspective. I know as compared to the Finance Act of 2021, VAT, there have not been so many changes. So we expect to see then what else could be introduced in the Finance Bill of 2022. From a customs and excise perspective, you may be aware that for customs is administered through the East African Community Customs Management Act, which means that the partner states in the EAC needs to come and agree on certain proposals. And therefore, we will be waiting for what will be coming in terms of customs. But the CES did indicate that from a Kenyan perspective, of the local produced goods, and 3, protecting critical sectors. So the understanding is that all the proposals will be gazetted through the EAC Gazette, and we expect these to be out by 1st of July 2022. Now, from an excise duty perspective, then we have seen, similarly as what was in the VAT Act, there's a lot of goodwill in terms of the manufacturing industry, and mostly geared, one, on the passenger motor vehicles. So locally manufactured passenger motor vehicles previously were subjected to excise duty between 20% to 30%, depending on the CC rating also, and on the fuel, that is whether it's a diesel or a petrol motor vehicle. So what we have seen is that the CS is proposing to exempt these locally manufactured motor vehicles from excess duty. Also, for pharmaceutical manufacturers, one of the components that is used in production of the medicaments is neutral spirits. Therefore, the rate which is existing is 278 shillings, 0.7 per each liter. And now, in order to boost the pharmaceutical industry, then we are seeing that the CS is proposing to do an exemption for any neutral spirits that is imported by pharmaceutical manufacturers. Also, for the eggs, you would recall last year, in order to support the local industry, there was introduced a rate of 25% on any eggs that is being imported into Kenya. But what we have seen is that there has been a reduced capacity in terms of, those fertilized eggs that are required, to fertilize and get more chicken. So in this proposal, we have seen that the CS is intending to exempt any eggs that are imported by licensed hatcheries, that is the hatched eggs, from the rate of 25% now to an exempt rate. Now, in terms of excise duty as a sin tax, in order to protect those harmful things that may impact the society, what we have seen is that there is an introduction of a new excise duty on any fees that is charged by the TV stations, print media, for advertising any gambling, gaming, and alcoholic beverages. So we'll see that previously there was no rate for this, but now they will be subjected to 15%. And I think the idea here is once you increase the cost of doing such advertisements, then they will be reduced and having a positive impact to the youth. Also, for what we call the liquid nicotine, and this is what is being, what is being used in what they're calling the vape, sometimes, and I think shisha would also fall as part of this, then we are seeing that previously the rate on liquid nicotine, or rather the current rate is Kenyan shillings 1,259.64 per kg. So what the CS is proposing is introduction of a rate per each ml, so that it becomes a higher excess duty rate. So in terms of, yes, getting more revenue, but also reducing the harmful effect that the liquid nicotine have on the society. So from an excess duty, then I think one of the most, let me say, peculiar proposal that we have is one, there is a percentage of 10% increase in a number of products, excluding petroleum products. The CS did not mention which products will be increased by 10%. So we know for excess duty, it applies to both goods and services. So we'll be waiting to see in the finance bill which products would be subjected to this 10% increase. Also, in terms of the annual inflation adjustment, so ideally in 2015, the Excess Duty Act introduced annual inflation adjustments, which normally are proposed by the Commissioner General in each year. So what is going to happen then is there's a proposal that the Commissioner General can exempt certain products from the annual inflation adjustment, but this is depending on the economic and social environment factors facing the product. So what is not clear is how the Commissioner General will determine which product will be impacted by this exemption. So I think one of the things that we need to watch out is in the finance bill is how is the Commissioner going to be able to exempt this product. So from a miscellaneous fees and levies act, we got two proposals that have been introduced by the CS. One is that for any inputs and raw materials that are being imported by the pharmaceutical companies, previously they are normally charged ADF of 2%, that is for any registered manufacturers, or 3.5% for non-registered manufacturers, and the railway development levy of 2%. So what the proposal is to exempt these products from the paying of these two levies. Also, in order to promote our farmers and also people who rear the cows, then there's normally an export levy of 80% or $0.5 per kg. So there is a proposal to reduce this to 50% or $0.32 per kg. So in terms of indirect taxes, that is the proposals that we had from the budget speech. So we'll be waiting to see whether there are any other proposals that will be introduced by the finance bill. I'll now take this chance to introduce Alex, who is going to take us through other changes. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. And as Alex comes on, ladies and gentlemen, please keep the conversation on the chat and Q&A going. It's very engaging. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ken, for that. We'll then move to a few changes that were proposed by the CS for other acts or pieces of legislation here in Kenya. So we start with the unclaimed assets that guys have outside there. So there is an incentive to now report those particular unclaimed assets to the Unclaimed Assets Authority. So what will happen is that then you get a waiver of penalties and interest for a period of 12 months. The other change is KRA is changing its name from Kenya Revenue Authority to Kenya Revenue Service. We expect that with this particular change of name and even the brand, that will have a more friendly KRA going forward. There's also a change for a perpetual term for tax-related regulations. So under the Statutory Instrument Act, then the CS has proposed that we remove the limit of 10 years for tax-related regulations to just basically ensure there's continuity in terms of tax administration. The big one in the room, and which perhaps has generated a lot of debate, is a requirement to pay 50% of disputed tax upfront. So meaning when you go to the tax appeals tribunal and if KRA wins, then you're required to pay 50% of that amount of tax that is in dispute before you appeal to court. The suggestion by the CS is quite unclear in terms of to what extent. So will it mean that the money will be kept for you until the Supreme Court makes the decision, assuming you run through to the Supreme Court? There's also a change there for refunds, basically to be done 30 days after the appeal is successful. So we all know, the pains that sometimes taxpayers have to get refunds from KRA. So we'll wait to see if you'll get your money back in 30 days if you win the case against the Revenue Authority. There's also a change, just a slight one, for KRA to now issue objection decisions within a cycle of one cycle of 60 days. So we hope that KRA will stick to this. Initially, KRA could extend the time for issuing an objection decision by just requesting for information, for example, on the 59th day, and you'd have another cycle of about 60 days for them to issue the objection decision. We also have a change to the Tax Procedures Act, where KRA seeks to get permission to register caveats on ships, aircrafts, and motor vehicles, over and above, the land that they could register caveat on as security for unpaid tax. So watch out, KRA could be coming for you on this rather small assets that you'd have if at the end of the day, then you have some unsettled liabilities with them. We've seen an attempt to harmonize county and national tax, levies, taxes and levies, sorry. And this is through the county government's revenue raising process bill. We hope that this will be discussed and it goes through so that you don't have one county levying taxes or levies, which would at that point prejudice national economic growth or movement of capital and labor across counties. To the other minor changes as we finish, we have a suggested change to the Capital Markets Act to allow licensing of single director companies and partnerships to provide investment advisory services. So I think this is in line with the New Companies Act. We still call it new, even though it's a 2015 act that allowed even single director companies to be set up here in Kenya. One that is interesting for pension funds is that there's a proposal to allow pension funds to invest in unlisted real estate investment trusts, provided that that is incorporated in Kenya and approved by the CMA. So we hope that pension funds will now have more places to put in investments for their guys. Clive mentioned about the debt ceiling, and for this particular change, it will come through an amendment to the Public Finance Management Act, basically to have the ceiling to 55% of GDP. For those of us who are in Kenya, you may have ridden on a motorcycle, and perhaps it wasn't safe at that point. So the CS is thinking about you and is proposing some change to the insurance regulations to require guys who own motorcycles and three-wheelers to then have insurance that would cover fare-paying passengers. And finally, we have new rates for rateable property that will be introduced through the National Rating Bill 2022. So we expect the government then to raise more revenue through these rates. So a couple of changes to all those acts that we've mentioned. So we'll wait to see what is in the finance bill. There are instances where the finance bill could include other provisions, and we expect then taxpayers will engage once we have that particular finance bill to make sure that public participation then gets in as is required. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you all the presenters who have tried to demystify some of the changes that came through the finance budget. Key takeaways, at least from where I'm sitting, is the issue of charitable organizations, and I did see a question coming up there. Important to clarify that you still need a valid, the recipient still needs a valid tax exemption certificate for that donation to qualify as tax deductible for the person making the donation. Another interesting one was really around the interest restrictions. So as James had talked about the thin capitalization, that has changed. Now interest restriction does apply to all companies excluding the financial sector. So it's whether you are local or foreign, you need to take into consideration thin capitalization. And I was hoping to hear that the minister then saying that it should be local companies should be exempted from that, but that did not happen. And then finally, a critical one for the governance of this country is the national tax policy that the CS alluded to is in draft and will be released for public participation. And that should give us some stability in terms of taxes for business. And finally, a critical one there is a change that we all saw, which is really the 50% that you need to pay for disputed amounts when going through any other court proceeding after the TAT. So a lot, and we're hoping to lobby some of these changes as we get into before the bill is signed into an act. Now, I'd like to given our understanding on now some of these changes that have already taken place, and perhaps the participants are in a better place to understand how it impacts their businesses and themselves, I'd like to rerun the initial poll question. So just should be coming up on your screen in a few. So this is the first question I asked. Having heard the different discussions that happened around the changes and how we're meant to generate the revenue that we need to sustain the economy, do you really think, once again, I'm going to ask this, do you really think the budget proposals, in your opinion, actually speak to the theme, which is of economic recovery for improved livelihoods? What is it that you are thinking? And also feel free to chat us and to drop your questions on the Q&A. So it seems that the indifferent is increasing. So we're at 40%. I would request participants to vote so that we can move to the next session, bearing this in mind. Okay. So it does seem that what our speakers have parted with has really made an impact, because I can see initially the negative was quite high. That seems to have dropped. And the indifferent was low, has also gone quite high. So I'm going to end the poll here and sharing the results. As you can see clearly, most of us feel indifferent to the changes in the budget, and likely so. It really might not have an impact on the economic recovery or improve the livelihoods of citizens at large. With that, I'd like us to move to the next session, and I'm going to request Jacinta Muridi, who's going to be the moderator for the panel discussion, to now take us forward. Jacinta is a senior manager within the tax and regulatory unit at KPMG East Africa and has been with the firm for 9 years, and she'll be taking us through a panel discussion, and she'll also introduce our panelists for this particular session. Jacinta, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandeep, and thank you so much to the speakers during this session. I think we felt it was important to just hear from the industry players and some of the advisors on what their thoughts were around the budget, and as such the reason and what informed this panel today. So with us today we have James Woodward, who's the head of transport and infrastructure for KPMG in Africa. And he leads our infrastructure strategy and has advised our clients across the public and the private sector. And he has experience in Kenya, Tanzania, Mauritius, Ethiopia, Australia, and UK. So it would be important to hear what James thinks about the budget and the infrastructure allocation and how far we are on some of the government projects. And then we're also joined by Vishal Soni. Vishal is a group financial controller and tax advisor in Mombasa Cement. And he's also the secretary of the ACCA, Kenya's Tax Steering Committee. And he represents the manufacturing sector on tax matters, financial planning and risk management. We also joined by Dennis Murigi, who's a managing director at Central Services at Flamingo Horticulture Group. And Dennis is key in contributing to some of the tax legislation changes in the industries and through lobbying initiatives, and he plays an active role in the Kenya Flower Council. And of course, we have our very own Peter Kinuthia, who's the partner and head of tax and regulatory. I'm sure he's a familiar face. So I think to start us off, I'd just like to ask Dennis, in terms of the budget allocation in the agricultural sector, what are your thoughts around it, since the CS really mentioned that, and as we all know, it's a key contributor to the GDP, and food security is a key agenda in the Big Four. So what are your thoughts around the Big Four, the allocation of the current year's budget? Dennis?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the call. I think from an agricultural perspective, what strikes me immediately is, the allocation of the total budget. It's such a small amount, roughly 2% or there and thereabouts, that's set aside to drive such a huge agenda for them. And if you were to break down what the government was talking about, you're really talking about large-scale production of staple food. You're talking about expansion of irrigation schemes, increased access to agricultural inputs, and the whole program of empowering and finding markets for small scale growers. Now, the 2%, 40 billion plus and thereabouts budget is not going to be sufficient. So for us, I think that's a concern in terms of given the fact that agriculture contributes a significant chunk into our annual GDP. So it gives me the impression that the focus of the government really is not on our sector, but elsewhere. That said, there are also certain incentives and certain areas within that we are experiencing as an industry that we expected the government to come in through the budget and cushion the sector. An area that we are probably concerned is the increasing price of inputs, which are all oil driven, and this points straight at fertilizers. Fertilizer prices have doubled, if not tripled, year on year, and we were kind of hoping that the government would help the industry by cushioning or providing some subsidies to help the farming and agricultural businesses. That's not coming through. We are also very concerned about, especially now this is the exporters, around the cost of freight. The cost of freight has again significantly doubled, to a certain extent tripled, and that exposes us, and we are not able to push, at least in the short term, that cost into the markets that purchase our products from us. Again, a very, very big concern, because it has a macro impact on how we operate, and we feel exposed as an industry. And my last point would probably be the whole issue of taxes and how taxes incentivize us, especially exporters, to operate within the country. I would have expected to see a lot more tax incentives to stimulate value addition, industries within the agricultural sectors in Kenya. That's not mentioned through any tax or incentivized tax reform. I know we've always had capital allowances extended if we were to expand into certain industries or areas. That's not clear. And another concern for us is always going to be the speed at which we receive our VAT refunds, which is an incentive that we have to produce and export out of Kenya. That has by and large improved, but is not as consistent as we would want it to be. So if I was to look at this budget, I feel that the agricultural sector is not really on the spotlight. There are many other areas that are on the spotlight, and again, I think the reception will be very lukewarm in our industry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dennis. And I think everyone shares the same sentiments, because I think since we were young, we all knew agriculture is the backbone of our economy. And I think the general feeling is that the government is probably not taking it as serious as everyone would hope them to take it. So thank you so much for your comments. I think the other insight is really around another Big Four agenda item that has also not really benefited as much as the people would expect in the budget. And this is around manufacturing sector, since the whole agenda was really revolved around creating jobs and just enhancing the livelihood of people. We had the CS yesterday state that there have been some investments made in the sector to create a conducive business environment and to support local industries. And this, in effect, will generate more jobs and improve livelihoods. So Vishal, what are your thoughts around some of the things that the government has done to support the manufacturing sector, and what can the government improve on?
Thanks, Jacinta. First of all, I'd like to thank KPMG for inviting me to be a panelist. I think the overall feel is that it was all talk and no action, because manufacturing industry has not benefited as much as we wanted to benefit from this budget. Although the finance bill is not yet out, but from the CS's speech, we cannot see any benefit addition to the industry. I mean, you can think about in terms of budget allocations, 500 billions are being allocated to education industry. And who's going to give them jobs? At the end of the day, you're going to have educated kibaruas, isn't it? I mean, the one industry which is capable of employing bulk of the country is manufacturing industry. And it is the same industry which is capable of lifting the economy of this country. Because when you look at it in terms of our net importer status, as a country, we are almost importing 90% of the products. And that basically shows that we are not tapping into the manufacturing sector. That means we are also importing other countries' inflation at the end of the day, because of the net importer status. So if you ask me, the country really needs to shift its backbone to manufacturing industry. I understand agriculture has always been the backbone, but if we are to grow in any which way that we think we want to grow, then manufacturing has to become the center.
Okay, thanks, Vishal. Do you think that the government has done anything at all to support that?
Well, to be very frank, last 2 years have been very tumultuous. And in reality, one of the things that we were really hoping for and pushing for was the tax policy. Because as manufacturers, we need that stability. You know, setting up a manufacturing company and getting it up and running requires a lot of capital. It's very capital intensive. And that means you're going to have to wait for your returns to come over almost 3 to 5 years, sometimes even 8 years. So you need to see that stability in the tax policy. Unfortunately, our country's tax policy is still work in progress, and we don't know when it's really going to come through. And if you've just seen the last 2 years, most of the tax incentives that manufacturers were getting, which were cushioning the manufacturers, have been revoked. A few have been returned, but not in the way in its full glory. So if you ask me, then they're basically not incentivizing manufacturing industries to grow. Also, foreign direct investors would not want to get into a country where their cash flow projections basically go haywire year on year based on a budget. You know, eventually speaking, if you even ask me about what Sandeep mentioned about thin capitalization, I think that is a major point, because thin capitalization was an issue only pertaining to foreign controlled entities, because the intention was to stop foreign controlled entities from transferring profits from Kenya to outside the country, right? But last year, this guys turned it into a local law. That means now even a local company who is heavily geared is going to be affected by this. You're going to cripple the economy by doing that. A lot of us are not foreign controlled. A lot of us are operating organically in Kenya, like Mombasa Cement. And these kind of laws are basically restricting us from taking more borrowings to grow.
Yeah, thanks, Vishal, for those comments. And it's interesting how the government is trying to discourage people from borrowing, yet borrowing is something that everyone is talking about. The government is doing a little bit too much on. Thank you so much, Vishal. I think I'd like us to talk about the other agenda on the agenda item on the Big Four, and this is really around affordable housing. Yeah, this year alone, it was allocated around 27 billion. So James, what are your thoughts around the allocation? Do you think the government has done enough with regards to this project? And are there any areas the government can improve on?
Thanks, Jacinta, and good morning, everyone. So I think the housing agenda as part of the Big Four it was very ambitious to start with and really quite complex for the government to try to implement. And along the way, we've had different roles in there trying to support them on transactions and on their strategy. But I think if we now look at where have they come from in this last political cycle since affordable housing was prioritized, if we look back, the start of that program was really looking at anchoring this program on a national housing levy of 1 to 1.5%, with the expectations from government that that would really blow up this space nice and quickly, and we'd see a lot of development moving forward. Now, with that being successfully challenged in court, that did to a certain extent send the government a little bit back to the drawing board. Now, we still have the National Housing Development Fund. It is an optional opt-in fund. Approximately 200,000 Kenyans have signed up for it, well short of the expectation, of course, when it was going to be compulsory. But in the way that the government has been trying to pivot there is they have tried to set all the base parameters there for making sure the policy and framework space is ready for the private sector to take up that mantle and be able to move this agenda forward. So we've had the tax incentives put in place. We have the development framework guidelines that are extremely clear what categorizes as affordable housing and how to go about accessing those. The government still has a number of its own projects it wants to run in joint venture, but it also allows for private sector to step into that place, into that space alone. Now, the big piece that we can see here this year is really around the role of the Kenya Mortgage Refinance Corporation. So the KMRC was really set up to try to build out that space to encourage lenders to be willing to shift down a little bit in the sort of economic hierarchy to potential home buyers that otherwise, in the current state of debt in the country, would not otherwise be looked at for making lending to. So where KMRC was to sit there behind these potential lenders, while the framework was in place, we didn't see sufficient allocation of capital to really bolster that as an entity that could then on-lend and support some of the commercial lenders to move down into this affordable housing space. So we're very happy to see the 12 billion that's been allocated across two different elements of really mobilizing and capitalizing KMRC. The KMRC structure is nothing new. It's a structure that's been used in many countries around the world. It's a World Bank endorsed structure. So finally seeing the capital being injected into that is very much welcome. The other element on the housing side that government has had to deal with is while we have private sector housing, we also have housing for government employees. So it's also very welcome that after a number of years, we're seeing the KDF housing projects move forward. We have police housing moving forward as well, and we have prisons. So that is really starting to build into a space where there's been much needed accommodation with the expectation of government providing it. We are seeing money flow into that space, which is welcome. On the specific affordable housing projects that we have sitting there, the government has still identified a number of flagship projects that they want to be rolling out in joint venture with the private sector. Government provides the land, the developer comes in to be able to push that forward. And there is a little bit of cash allocation required there, particularly around the supporting infrastructure to make those larger flagship projects work. So we have seen an allocation for some of those to move. But also it's been quite welcome seeing the government not just look at the affordable housing space, but what they have referred to this year as the affordable and decent housing as being part of that Big Four agenda. So we've also seen, while we move from the higher end to affordable, there's also allocation that's sitting in there for the social housing space and slum upgrade as well. So we are seeing a mix across the different elements of the housing sphere and different economic groups being supported in this space. But really the key change is going to be, can KMRC take that capital that they're now being allocated and leverage that through the work that they will need to do quite intensively with local commercial banks to encourage them to now enter into this space. So I think that has really unlocked hopefully a lot of private sector-led development that can then push this affordable housing space forward beyond this first 5 years of the Big Four agenda. Thank you, Jacinta.
Okay, thanks a lot, James. And I think we look forward to seeing how that will affect, not just because sometimes you feel like the affordable housing will affect a certain class of people, but it needs to go down to the common mananchi so that they can feel the impact of this particular change. I think tied to the Big Four agenda, I think the feeling is there's not been enough allocation by the government for the Big Four agenda, but a winner in the Big Four agenda is always infrastructure. It gets some huge allocations. So I don't know, do you feel like the government is prioritizing the infrastructure over other sectors?
Look, I think it's a fair question, and we can even see it from the first poll that we ran this morning, asking the audience where they think the government has really been delivering or prioritizing, and overwhelmingly, because we can see the infrastructure that's being put in place, it's quite easy to associate that with progress and associate it with debt obligations and with economic growth. So I think from my perspective, I look at the question a little bit differently, and I think rather than prioritizing infrastructure over other sectors, I look at it more from the perspective of prioritizing infrastructure alongside and for the benefit of other sectors. So infrastructure is never really going to be an end in itself. It's always going to be an enabler. And most importantly, I think for this budget round, while infrastructure has done well, there are two sort of key pieces that we really need to pick up on there. First is that infrastructure development is a very good and fast-tracked way to try to support economic recovery. So we have, even beyond the East African region, we can see at a global level, if we listen to global leaders talking about build back better, there are enormous injections being made in infrastructure and new infrastructure development around the world to help us move beyond COVID and into that economic development that's actually needed. So continuing to prioritize infrastructure at this point of time can have some short-term benefit as much as long-term. But at the end of the day, if we want to summarize where is that money going this time, we have roads, sort of as expected, that network needs to continue to be built out. We have the elements of the SGR as that is really being closed out as a project as a whole, getting as far as we anticipate it to get for the next few years. But in the transport space, it's quite interesting to see the uplift around public transport related infrastructure. The Nairobi commuter rail, the bus rapid transit that will be coming across the country as well. So beyond transport, in the water sector, that it's great to see that we're seeing some transmission projects starting to get some attention as well. But I think one of the big shifts that we're seeing there is on the energy side. Now, while there's still a large allocation, there has been quite a debate over the last few years whether or not we really need extra power. Do we need more power plants? Even if they are, whether they are water or geothermal, whatever technology they might be that might be quite green, is there really the requirement for us to be bolstering up our generation capacity at the rate that we've been doing? And I think what we can see from this budget at the moment is that there is a shift. We do still have geothermal, but we are shifting across to transmission and distribution. And that is very welcome because that is the part of the energy value chain that has really been underinvested in. So our ability to connect that power across the country, our ability to prioritize it to manufacturing hubs, that's the kind of shift that we were hoping to see. And that's now where the money's going. So less of a risk of these big white elephant projects sitting out there generating power that we don't need, and more of a focus on getting the power we do have to the people that need it. But at the end of the day, I think that the main point here when we talk about prioritizing infrastructure, we have to look at what's the implication of the new PPP Act. And we have had a bit of an issue in this country over the last few years where the lack of speed in executing PPP projects has led the government to revert back to on-balance sheet deals where they need to utilize their treasury allocation towards getting these projects to move. But if we look at what this new PPP Act has, which came in at the end of last year, we're now much clearer that we can see a path to closing out these projects quicker. So it's a faster procurement process. It's less approvals that need to be there. And critically, that opens up private capital to finance these infrastructure projects. So we have government allocation, but if we can get these PPPs to move faster, we will see that commercial banks, development finance institutions are willing to provide that funding to the private sector to develop these PPPs out. That crucially means we're off government balance sheet. We're not needing to dive into treasury allocation. One, just anecdotally, something that I think is quite exciting that sort of draws our attention to a potential shift away from further government allocation in the future would be on one of the road projects. It's a PPP up in the northeastern part of the country. Last Friday, they managed to go to market as the sponsors of the project, not the government, and raise a local currency medium-term note, effectively a bond. And that came from pension funds, and it came from local insurance companies as well. It was 240% oversubscribed. So what that is telling us is that local capital, as much as international capital, is willing to invest in the infrastructure sector for a return. And if we can unlock that, that reduces the requirement for us to keep going back to Treasury in future budgets. So the success of this PPP program, if we can see the expectations of this act coming to fruition, we should see less required allocation directly from government budget going forward. There will still always be a few projects that are going to need that government subsidy, that government support. And that's where it draws us back to that the conversations we've been having earlier this morning around debt management and making sure we have the right type of debt being allocated to these projects to absolutely minimize the exposure for government where we can. So from my perspective, I think, yes, we have prioritized infrastructure again. I think it is the right thing to do given the global Build Back Better initiative and what this can do for economic recovery. But if we compare that with successfully executing this new PPP Act, I think that we're sending our infrastructure development and the financing of that in the right direction for years to come. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, James, for your insights. I think now that you mentioned debt management, it will be the best time to invite Caxton and hear his thoughts around Kenya. I think there are different varying opinions. There are people who feel like Kenya needs to live within its means. They need to stop borrowing. And there are other people who feel like it's not too bad. It's not as bad as we feel. or think. So what do you think about our country's debt management? Is it sustainable, and what are the options that are available to unlock poor debt?
Thank you very much, Jacinta. And I'm not too sure why we have chosen to end with the biggest question that has been bedeviling generally Kenyans, especially around this time. And the issue of debt and what we can do, how we can manage it, and where we are. Maybe before I respond to those specifics, I just wanted to maybe again repeat a comment I had said at the start of this session, that as human beings, we are very opinionated, and all of us have an opinion around most things. I'm not saying that in any degrading way, but because I'm also a Kenyan, I also have an opinion. But it's also my view that an opinion can be informed or uninformed. So you always have to question what is the source of the information on which the opinions are based. Having said that, it is true that human beings are generally risk averse, and debt is associated with risk. So by that mere fact, you will find that people will always view debt negatively, and they will tell you avoid it. So, and that, in my view, is what really informs most opinions out there about the common mwananchi, that Kenya is heavily indebted. On the other hand, if you flip it and you ask maybe people we call the entrepreneurs, yeah, the Elon Musks of this world, the Zuckerbergers, the people who are self-starters and who have really made a wealth of fortune for themselves, they will tell you you cannot, you really cannot advance without debt. You cannot progress. So debt is good. So now when we look at these opposing views, we just have to look then at the position where we are as a country and say, we have a GDP of about 14 trillion. And this is the number given by CBK. If you use the budget estimates, and you will see maybe 13.3, depending on the exchange rate you use. Yes, let's just use a round number of 14 million. So now the question again has come, and we saw it during the questions that have been streaming through, that as a country, you had of us rebasing our debt ceiling to 55% of GDP and moving away from what we have had in the past, which is an absolute number that had been capped at 9 trillion. And what does that mean? I said we can just throw some bit of numbers around that and do some bit of mathematics. If you look at the current GDP at 14 trillion Kenya shillings, 55% of that gives you 7.5 trillion. So the current debt, both the domestic and foreign, totals 8.4 trillion. So meaning if that law were to be implemented now, we're already running afoul of the base or the cap that we've set for ourselves, or we want to set of 55%. So what will be the options open to the government? One, it will be a requirement then to retire a lot of these loans immediately. That one doesn't look like a possibility. The other alternative would be to do what Nigeria did a few years back and rebase the economy. When they did that, if you remember, Nigeria leapfrogged South Africa as the biggest economy in Africa. So by our parliamentarians or our technocrats coming up with this suggestion or with this proposal to base our debt ceiling on as a percentage of GDP, they've basically introduced what we call a moving target. It is expected that our GDP is going to grow year on year. It has been growing for the longest, and it is projected to keep growing. So 55% of 14 trillion today may be 7.5. If it grows to 16 trillion, even without rebasing, that number of the debt ceiling goes up, and so on and so forth. So in a way, we want to have a standard number of a bigger and growing thing. And you would say there is some bit of wisdom in doing that, because most places have actually put a percentage of the GDP as debt shouldn't be static. It is an indicator of how the economy performs overall. But then again, on the question of whether our debt is really sustainable, and this is really a big question, I thought it would be good to consider a few countries out there, first world, third world. And if we look at the debt to GDP ratio by country in 2022, and some of the countries with the highest proportion of the debt to GDP is Venezuela. It probably doesn't make a lot of headlines at 350, but everybody knows Japan. The Japan ratio is at 266%. If I ignore other countries, let me talk of Singapore, is at 131%. United States, 128%. These are countries we know, and we are seeing their debt is higher than their gross domestic product. So, and how then have they sustained it? Some people will say, if we compare Kenya with those countries, we'll not be comparing like with like. We'll not even be comparing mangoes with apples, because at the very least, those ones are round. So there is some bit of similarity. Some people have opined that that's like comparing bananas with strawberries. Totally unrelated. But for me, looking at it objectively, we are looking at a country, we are looking at its gross domestic product, and we are looking at its size of debt. Totally comparable. Again, if we don't look at the first world countries, let's look at the lowest countries with the lowest, I think, percentage debt to GDP. And in that list of 10, I just want to focus on those that are from Africa. We have Congo at 15.2%. There is Eswatini from Lesotho at about 15.5%, Burundi 15.9%, and Botswana at about 18.2%. This would be the ideal if you ask a Kenyan out there, but the circumstances around each country are different. The size of infrastructure, the projects that are necessary to spur economic growth are all different. So you would say it is good to not have debt, but then again, it would mean you stagnate. If focusing on Africa alone, you will find that Kenya actually at 69.7 ranks 18. So there are 17 other countries that are ahead of Kenya in terms of their debt to GDP. And Eritrea is at 175, that's the worst. We have other countries that we like comparing ourselves with, maybe Zambia, it's at 100%. Rwanda, it's even ahead at 75%. So what do I want to achieve by quoting all these statistics? I think in a word, and I dare say, at this point, all indications are Kenya's current debt carrying capacity is moderate, and so far the overall debt burden is sustainable. So those are big words, but based on all those statistics I have provided, I think they are supported, and we can all agree, or even if we are not, we do not want to play, politics with this, you'll say objectively, the statistics bear us out, but then we are saying statistics alone do not give us comfort. There is need for prudence in the management of the national resources, which in effect push the government to borrow. So the Public Debt Management Office within Treasury has a huge task, and a Herculean task of just keeping the borrowing within check. To my mind, all we need to ask ourselves, is the debt productive? So, and how do we tell whether it is productive? It is only if and only when the gains or the returns from those funds outweigh the costs of borrowing those funds. So that is all we need to ensure. If you're borrowing to build a road, the economic gains from that road should really outweigh the cost of paying for that road. And one other way then, look, if we all move to concessionaire, we have seen what this expressway has done. Built in record time, The government will not have to pay directly. It is you and me as we use this that will come in and help sustain this project. So among the measures, as Jacinta has asked, that we can use to unlock, our question of debt. First of all, restructuring, everyone has spoken about that. Clive spoke about restructuring debt. Make it a lot more long-term, extend maturity. That is really a no-brainer. We also, as we have done before, we have sought debt waivers and debt reliefs from institutions like World Bank, IMF, and those who have extended those facilities. We would want, again, if we look a little more locally, extend the maturity of our treasury bills and bonds. So that gives the country a little breathing space and time within which to repay its debt. Another good thing, and has really picked up in the last few things, and I'm sure James here has mentioned or alluded to that, public-private partnerships. There are ways in which you lessen the pressure on government to deal with major projects. A few months back, I had a discussion with one of the economic technocrats, and he was saying government has no business, doing some of the projects that it does. And all those
I think we lost Caxton.
Should really be handed over to the private.
Caxton, we're losing you.
Within talking about countries, it is not so unsustainable as of now, but we have to check the rate at which the public debt is growing. Finally, and I am sure Jacinta might be timing me, the government needs to lower the public debt burden by limiting unnecessary expenditure. And if that is not very possible, then we know we have always asked our revenue authorities, our tax authorities to improve on their tax collections so that everybody bears some bit of this public expenditure. They bring, their tax on their income so that all of us together can make this burden a little more sustainable. So I would want to stop at that point and maybe just hand it back to Jacinta in case there is a follow-up on that.
Thanks a lot, Caxton, for your insights. They were quite elaborate. And Vishal, I'll just give you like 30 seconds because we've run out of time completely.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up comment on Caxton's point. I think he makes a point that we shouldn't be demonizing debt. Debt can actually help you increase your return on investments. But from a Kenyan perspective, we need to see what is that debt being used for. I mean, right now we're using a lot of it to just service previous debts, and it's not being used productively. So that is a factor we need to consider. And obviously a very, very hidden in between the lines factor is corruption, because how much is being financed for that? We probably need to open our eyes to that. So yeah, that's about it. I hope 30 seconds were done.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much to our panelists for your insights. And majority of the people agree with you in the chat box. So those were really, really great insights. So let me hand it back to Sandeep.
Thank you very much, Jacinta, and great appreciation to each and every panelist for giving your valuable insights and contributions towards the future of this particular country. A lot has been said, a lot has been discussed. So, and I know we are 10 minutes above time. So I'm going to, a lot of your questions have been already answered live, and we do appreciate you interacting with us. I'm therefore going to invite our head of tax, Caxton, to give closing remarks as we release you all to get back to doing business and generating tax revenue. Caxton, over to you.
Thank you, Sandeep. Yeah, that was, I guess, in a presentation of the time that it has taken benefit of listening to. Before any laws can take effect, they have to be enacted. You know, the publishing of the finance bill is probably in the works, and that one will have to be approved within the next 60 days. That's before 30th of June. And between now and then, as you heard from the many proposals that were, laid down yesterday by the CS, there are those of you that are affected differently in terms of those provisions. And we are always given a window of opportunity to do submissions to the relevant committee of parliament, that is the Finance and National Planning Committee. The various stakeholders that are affected differently could be manufacturers, could be people in the agricultural sector, wherever, tourism, all those sectors of this economy, and you feel that there are some proposals that you need to lobby against or make submissions. This is what we expect to be happening in the next few weeks before finally we have the Final Finance Act. So for us, again, in terms of setting the timelines, that's what is expected going forward. And certainly be in touch. We'll keep a tab on what's happening. We will be, again, collating our own views and submissions around some of the proposals. Like the chief among which the requirement to deposit 50% of disputed tax revenue. I think that is already generating a lot of heat. We know that one thing that is good, that the government is coming up with a national tax policy, which is going to stand everyone in good stead in terms of knowing what is to expect. How is our operating environment? It has often been said that for most investors, they really do not look for tax incentives as they do look for a stable and operating environment. So we really applaud and are looking forward to the finalization of this national tax policy, so that all of us as investors in this country, as advisors, as tax collectors, we can be guided by one document that can be referred to and referenced to. So with that, I would want to thank everybody who has remained here with us. We have gone through various things. We looked at the macro environment that Clive took us through. We went through the fiscal highlights. We had a team led by Stephen Nganga. We had James Kimani, Ken Wanjohi, Alex Kanyi, and of course the panel discussions that have been moderated by Jacinta Murithi. And the coordinator or the MC for today's function has been Sandeep Main. So I do thank them and thank all of you that have remained with us. And I can see we still have quite a huge sizable number still here. The art of budget making, like we said, it's never a straightforward one. So they are always back and forth. There are a few things that will affect different people differently. Here, our aim was just to give the highlights. And from here, if you have specifics, please do get in touch with us and we'll be happy to assist however we can, and which if you have with patient ears attended, we're here has missed, our toil shall strive to mend. And how shall we mend this? Is by responding to questions that you may have, by sending you the materials that we have used for this presentation, as I have seen people asking, and for remaining here to respond and to assist you in this process should you have any specific needs as a result of the budget provisions and the changes that have been proposed. So with that, I do want to thank you very much. All the questions that have come through, we saw questions coming through fast and furious. The team working behind the scenes have responded to all the questions as far as I can see. If there was any question that is not responded to, I am sure we have all the details, your email addresses, and we'll certainly be coming back to you with our responses. So with that, thank you very much. God bless you. I do have a wonderful end of week, and I wish you all the very best as you continue building this country, as you continue playing your part in getting this country forward. So thank you very much. God bless you all. That will be all from us for today. Thank you.